This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. What disturbs and depresses people is the hunt for happiness. There are few ideas as intuitive as thinking positively will make me happy. And in some ways, this is absolutely true. After all, moping around the house all day, bemoaning your terrible fate, is not a surefire route to contentment, to say the least. But I do think that positive thinking can be taken too far. And I am not the only one. The phrase toxic positivity has been coined to describe when being overly optimistic becomes outright destructive, blinding us to the harsher realities of life and eventually leading to our despair. And considering the advice to just think positive is certainly not going away anytime soon, I want to take a look at the ugly places this comforting cliche can go if it is followed through uncritically. But first, if we are going to talk about toxic positivity, we ought to define it, just so we're all on the same page moving forward. And if it's your first time, then welcome. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Don't you know that you're toxic positivity? Toxic positivity, like buzzword, is a bit of a buzzword, and as a result, it can become very difficult to talk about it with any clarity. It's also a new enough term and a new enough recognized phenomenon that there is not even an agreed upon definition within formal empirical research on the topic. There are a lot of general ideas, like that it's being inappropriately positive or that it involves dismissing so-called negative emotions, but I am going to define toxic positivity in its broadest sense with the following 3 properties. 1. The idea that a given situation is good or desirable. 2. This position is argued for on false or unjustified premises or flawed reasoning chains. And 3. This positivity causes some harm. I think this denotes an extremely wide idea of toxic positivity that will capture most intuitive instances of it. It also helps distinguish it from clear, non-toxic instances of positivity. To take very extreme examples, arguing that life is good because you have a stable income, a loving family, and a roof over your head may be positive, but it doesn't seem at all toxic because provided that those are all true, this happiness is not based on unjustified premises, but seems entirely appropriate. By contrast, telling someone that they should not be sad despite their parents dying tragically in a car crash because some people have it worse seems much more like toxic positivity, partly because it employs a flawed reasoning chain. There is nothing about other people having it worse that implies that this situation is not also worth being upset over. Defining toxic positivity along the lines of reasoning chains and unjustified premises also encompasses situations where positivity is enforced simply by social pressure. If your community responds to any expression of sadness with instinctive hostility, then no reasoning chain is employed at all, and having no reasoning chain is effectively the same thing as having a flawed one, as it makes every conclusion a non sequitur. I've left the third constraint intentionally quite vague by using the word harm, which is itself pretty unspecified. If you think that an attitude based on false premises is inherently undesirable, then you may think that this criterion is superfluous, since anything falling under the first 2 parts of the definition will also, by definition, also fall under the third. However, I also want to allow for happy illusions that don't necessarily cause distress in the long term, but might nonetheless be based on what I would consider false premises. For instance, I am an atheist, but I do not think that believing your loved ones have gone to a better place upon death is necessarily toxic positivity. If it brings someone comfort and gets them through a very difficult grieving process, then I really don't see the harm in it. I don't think that it's true, but I also don't think that it is toxic. Of course, this also means that what is toxically positive for one person may not be toxically positive for another, since the same thing might help one person and harm another person. Someone appealing to a heavenly afterlife to make mourning that little bit easier does not seem toxically positive, even if we say that there is no such thing as an afterlife. But someone actively wishing for a martyr's death on the same premise may be toxically positive. Again, provided that the belief in the afterlife is false. The martyr is likely to harm themselves because, by definition, they will be seeking the opportunity to perish for their faith. It feels strange to describe this sort of religious fervor as toxic positivity, but I genuinely do think that it fits the bill, even if it is a very extreme version of it. Though, obviously, if you are religious, then this may not necessarily qualify as toxic positivity, as you may think that it's based on true premises and may even think that it is a good thing to do. So far, this is all pretty abstract. But we can illustrate the definition with some classic examples of modern toxic positivity, and then go into much more detail about the examples later in the video. One toxically positive belief might be, I can do anything, or I will definitely achieve my dreams. It encourages a positive attitude, but is based on an overestimation of our power in the world. As we will see, it also encourages us to blame ourselves for everything that goes wrong in our lives, since, according to this belief, we could have always done something about them, and thus it does seem like they're our fault. Another is, everything happens for the best, or, to use a more classic variation, this is the best of all possible worlds. This idea was popularized by the philosopher Leibniz and was heavily criticized by Voltaire in his novel Candide. It may also bring some pleasure in the short term, but it flies in the face of fact, and can easily lead us to believe our upset or sadness is totally unjustifiable. And toxically positive beliefs are not just found in broad philosophies of life, they also occur in specific domains. In romance, people sometimes say, there is someone out there for everyone, or some variation on, my Prince Charming is out there somewhere. This relies on a sort of mystical, amorous metaphysics where finding our one true love is destined from the start. It's comforting, sure, but it can also encourage people to have unrealistic expectations of love, as if their partnership is going to be some mythical paradise where nothing bad ever happens. It also means they might believe that love's the kind of thing that happens to them, rather than something that they need to work for or a skill they need to cultivate. It also means that we may disregard someone over something completely trivial because that's not what the one would do. Toxic positivity also occurs in the prescriptive proposition that we must be happy all the time, and that being sad is not just unpleasant, but aberrant, indicating some fault with us or our minds. This can even tip over into viewing unhappiness as a moral failing, a deficiency of character like being greedy or cruel. It seems like toxically positive beliefs can form a scale based on either how far it drifts from reality or how much damage it does to the believer. Saying there is someone out there for everyone can cause some damage, in my opinion. But considering that over 50% of people in most nations do end up being married at least once, it is not totally outside the realms of plausibility. On the other hand, the idea that human unhappiness is a sign of a deficient or immoral personality rather than an unavoidable part of our reality is much further fetched. Can you say further fetched? I think you can. Lastly, we can distinguish between toxically positive beliefs and a toxically positive attitude. A toxically positive belief is, as we've defined above, a happy-seeming but harm-causing falsehood. A toxically positive attitude is more nebulous, and it's an outlook that just refuses to recognize hardships or negativity when they do appear. As a result, a toxically positive attitude will be more likely to generate toxically positive beliefs. We can think of it as a bit like being in an irritable mood. While you might be angry at something, an irritable mood makes you more likely to get angry at anything that comes your way. In philosophy, this is known as a basal attitude, and it's a good way to distinguish holding a particular proposition from a vaguer mood or outlook on life. It is the difference between liking someone and being the kind of person who tends to see the best in people. I would also speculate that holding numerous toxically positive beliefs could tip over into a toxically positive attitude. If you genuinely do think that everything happens for the best and that you have some great destiny awaiting you that's written in the stars, then it does make more sense to dismiss any negative feelings as totally unjustified. Thus, what began as a mere belief then develops into a basal attitude. I'll admit, that was a pretty heavy slog of distinctions and definitions. So I think we should move on to discussing some of the most popular toxically positive beliefs around today and why I think we should be so very skeptical of them. Starting with something parents all across the world tell their young children. But before we move on, I want to take a brief moment to thank our very kind sponsors for this video, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real pain. First, you have to choose a domain name, and then you have to design the whole thing. And there's always this voice in the back of your head warning you that you might be building something that not only looks messy, but looks outright unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They have ready-made templates to take all of the headache and stress out of website building. They also have a feature called Design Intelligence, which uses AI tools to help you make design choices, which is very handy if, like me, you're not necessarily that gifted at website design and don't have the mind of a graphic designer. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video. 2. Delusions of Power. In many of our societies today, we place quite a lot of emphasis on empowerment and keeping people assured of their own ability to influence the world. And there is pretty good reasoning behind this. It has been consistently shown that if you chronically underestimate your ability, you will perform less well at certain tasks. Though it is worth noting that this finding has largely been observed in school settings and that some more recent papers have questioned this overall consensus, especially in other contexts. But these nuances aside, it is still received wisdom that if someone estimates their competence in a given task rather highly, they are more likely to perform well on that task. This is often because they persist in the task for longer, investing more effort since they believe that if they just try hard enough, they are very likely to succeed. We also observe how destructive the opposite extreme can get. Research in learned helplessness describes how, when someone does not feel like their efforts are at all likely to succeed, they often underperform on tasks and give up their efforts far too easily. This is corroborated with studies into stereotype threat, where the average performance of groups who are told that they are ill-suited for a particular task perform less well on that task. But this effect is also lessened with targeted self-affirmation, suggesting that it is the lack of self-belief that is causing the underperformance. Given this general idea, it is easy to fall into thinking that a higher perception of one's own ability is always good, though it is worth noting that the evidence is not nearly as strong for this conclusion, since most research is on isolated instances like formal exams, rather than evaluating general performance in the long term across a wide range of metrics. And, contrary to this self-esteem aggrandizing view, some philosophers are very worried that we are overemphasizing our ability to achieve and ultimately making our lives much worse as a result. Perhaps the most famous modern thinker to put forward this view is Byung-Chul, who linked an overestimation in ability with burnout and despair. In his view, to tell someone that they can achieve anything is a vicious lie. They cannot achieve anything. Much of their life is just out of their hands, and they are limited by all sorts of situational factors. For instance, I weigh about 90 kilos. I will never be a world-class jockey, no matter how hard I tried. But if we have it drilled into us that we can achieve anything if we only work hard enough, then it is easy to blame ourselves whenever anything goes wrong. After all, you must have just not put in the effort. If you'd only worked that bit more, you probably would have succeeded. Of course, this is true some of the time, but it's clearly situational. If I don't study for a test and then I fail it, then that's on me. But if I fail a test because I have a serious case of the flu on the day of the exam, then that is outside of my control. But if I genuinely think that I can achieve anything, then this distinction just falls apart. What starts off as a nice-sounding optimistic platitude quickly becomes the crushing weight of unlimited expectations. A good example of this is gifted kid burnout, where people who are told they had exceptional abilities as a child suffer immensely when they discover that they too have limits, and that the expectation that they will change the world or become the best at something was probably misplaced. For me, this is a fantastic example of a toxically positive overestimation of abilities. To generalize from these examples, this form of toxic positivity is a delusion of control. It suggests that the outcomes in the world and in our lives are far more down to our actions than is actually the case. And it's worth noting, this is not a new phenomenon. We find it in Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy all the way back in the 6th century. Here, Boethius faces a truly awful fate, to be executed on trumped-up charges by the Byzantine state for standing up to what he saw as outright corruption. In his cell, he pens this work as a way of coping with his impending doom. And something that frustrates him to no end is that his death will be unjust. If he had actually committed some heinous crime, then at the very least he could reassure himself that he kind of deserved this. But to be executed specifically for being good strikes him as unbelievably painful. In response to this, he comforts himself with the realization that fortune is fickle, and that being good is no assurance of coming out on top in any situation. He recognizes that sometimes you can do everything right and still fail. This is not some personal fault, it is just how Lady Fortuna changes her whims. To quote esteemed philosopher Frank Sinatra, "That's life, that's what all the people say, you're riding high in April, shot down in May." And yes, I know he didn't write that song. We get it. You know a lot about jazz. The point still stands. Maybe one of the most pernicious yet popular forms of this style of toxic positivity is that we can all achieve our dreams. In the short term, it is wonderful to feel like this is true. It can be motivating or comforting to feel like all of our hard-won efforts will pay off in the end, and we will achieve our dream life, our dream career, our dream family, and a whole lot more. But sadly, this is just not the case. Most of us will never achieve our ambitions, and even if we do, we will probably just keep coming up with new ambitions until we inevitably don't achieve some of them. This point was made brilliantly by the pessimistic philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who argued that what we desire is often pretty divorced from reality. In the real world, we are limited by all sorts of things: our ability, our time, our prior commitments. But our desires are formed in our imagination, where anything is possible. We can so clearly picture ourselves living our dream life that it really seems like it's possible. But Schopenhauer thinks there are only two options here. Either we will not achieve these desires and be disappointed, or, against all the odds, we will achieve them, only to discover that they do not make us nearly as happy as we thought. Our minds will create new desires. We will think, I can't possibly have achieved my dreams yet, since I am still not satisfied. So, we'll postpone the dream one more step. Come up with a slightly bigger fantasy, slightly larger desires. We often think that our wants are like filling a hole in the ground, and that one day the hole will be full and we will finally be happy. But Schopenhauer thinks it is much more like feeding a fire. No matter how much fuel you'll give it, the fire will soon eat it up, and then demand more in its place. To quote the pessimistic philosopher Emile Cioran, "All men who cast a glance over their past ruins imagine that it is in their power to recommence something radically new. Every man promises everything, but every man lives to know the fragility of his spark and life's lack of genius in his life." The common thread between these examples of overestimating control is unduly heightened expectations. If we begin by thinking that we control an exaggerated amount of the world, then we will expect life to go a certain way. We will imagine that we can overcome all obstacles, that people will come to appreciate our unique gifts, that our supreme talent and ability will eventually come to be recognized. But none of this is necessarily true. It is lovely if it happens, but to think that it definitely will, and more than this, that we can definitely make it happen with determination, grit, and the sheer ferocity of our desires, is to set ourselves up for disappointment, disillusionment, and despair. I wanted to mention this type of toxic positivity specifically because I think it is all too common today. The people who incessantly spread this message that anyone can achieve anything probably genuinely do believe that this is true, or that, even if it's not, it is a happy illusion. But I hope that this section has persuaded you that things are much more complex than this. I'm not suggesting that someone's potential should be minimized or that they should be told an equally harmful lie, the lie that they'll never amount to anything and it's all hopeless. I'm just suggesting that we can find a sensible middle ground between these two poles. One where, to draw from my favorite Stoic philosopher Epictetus, we recognize just how much of life is outside of our control, but also do not neglect what is truly in our hands. But now I want to turn to a very different kind of toxic positivity. If this was toxic positivity about ourselves, our next target is toxic positivity about the world itself. 3. A charmed life. In much of the early work of Friedrich Nietzsche, there is a general attitude that life is almost unbearable in its unaltered state. In The Birth of Tragedy, he argues that most of us can only confront the bare truth about reality if it is reflected in great art. This is a view he would later come to abandon, suggesting that with enough strength of will, we could look life directly in the face, but learn to endure and rejoice in it. Though, of course, like everything about Nietzsche, there are differing interpretations on both of these points. It's a view he had initially inherited from Arthur Schopenhauer, who also believed that most people could not bear the full weight of life, at least not without a glossy coat of paint put over it. However, I think they would both be very skeptical of having an excessively illusory view on life. And, specifically, they would both heavily criticize the belief that life is somehow necessarily easy or would involve little to no suffering. Looking around, our culture has inherited an awful lot of positive-sounding platitudes about life that I would argue do constitute toxic positivity. We have already mentioned ones like everything turns out for the best, or it is all meant to be, or it is always darkest before the dawn. But now I want to examine them in a bit more detail. I should say, I don't think these are always bad. As a temporary comfort in difficult times, I'm sure they can form happy passing illusions to take the edge off of existence. But if we internalize them too much, they can give us a deeply skewed idea of life that is ultimately going to come crashing down on us. The ancient Stoic philosopher Seneca used to caution specifically against having a too rosy view of reality. He argued that there were few greater recipes for long-term misery than to imagine that life will inevitably go well, and that hardships will be few and far between. Instead, he recommended that we occasionally pause and reflect upon the genuine worst-case scenarios that could happen to us. This was not to be some macabre rumination designed to stoke our anxiety, but instead a sort of mental preparation. The thought that life will always be good is transformed into life will bring numerous severe hardships, but this is in the nature of life, and I should not expect it to be any different. On the surface, you might think that this would make him miserable, but Seneca said that this outlook allowed him to endure difficulties much more easily. Rather than the sufferings taking him by surprise, they were instead greeted like an unwelcome but ultimately expected visitor. By contrast, if we imagine that life will always be easy or that it is necessarily and inevitably good, then hardship will take us completely by shock. We will add to our suffering because we will be unprepared for what has come to pass. But personally, I think it goes far beyond this. The trouble with having this rose-tinted view on life is that it makes suffering not just painful, but also a break from the norm. Rather than some harm being unavoidable as a fact of life and acting to prevent the harm that we can, it seems like a cosmic injustice. We will feel betrayed by the universe itself. We were sold an idea that it was the world's job to be kind to us, and when the uncaring face of reality unveils itself, we are taken aback by the sheer dishonesty of it all. In more severe forms, this can manifest in the same type of self-blame and self-hatred that our previous examples of toxic positivity did. If we imagine that life is unalterably good, it naturally follows that we ought to be happy. It means that the reasonable reaction to existence is positive, optimistic, and cheery. Thus, if we are not those things, if we find ourselves feeling sad or melancholic, if we feel our love for life fading, if some days we struggle to get out of bed, or that the world does not seem like a gift but a daunting task, that life is not some grand adventure but instead a Sisyphean effort, that consciousness is not the divine spark lighting up reality, but a curse of excessive awareness that sometimes comes with anxiety, inner torment, and agony, if we sometimes feel all of this, then we will naturally conclude that the problem is always us. Our negative reactions can never be the appropriate response to the ups and downs of the human experience, but instead must always be a personal failing. Somehow, we have failed in seeing the inherent brilliance in whatever situation we happen to have fallen into. We should really be happy that our loved one has passed away, or that we are painfully ill or cripplingly lonely, or that everything we have worked so hard for is crumbling before our eyes. This seemingly banal platitude denies us the obvious truth that sometimes bad things happen and that life can suck, and that to be unhappy is not always a malfunction of perspective, but can be a natural and almost unavoidable reaction. It is not always a sign that we are not tough enough, but sometimes a reasonable reflection of the circumstances we are in. Early Theravada Buddhism recognized this, which is why the near inevitability of suffering is baked into so much of the work around this philosophy. In just one of the Tripitaka's many, many parables, suffering is compared to being hit by an arrow. According to this story, each time that pain arrives, we can compound the pain with our reactions. We can feel shame at our sorrow, or we can cry out that the universe itself is against us. We can get angry at ourselves, or embarrassed, or frustrated. By our reaction, we intensify the pain, like tightening our grasp on a hot iron in the mistaken belief that this will cool it down faster. The parable itself compares this to being hit by a second arrow, this time one that is completely optional. However, with a different attitude, one that recognizes suffering will come, but does not get attached enough to it to be carried away with these reactions that exacerbate the suffering, we could learn to only be hit by the first arrow. I would argue that a toxically positive set of beliefs about the world will lead us to being like the first character in the parable. The natural conclusion of being overly optimistic about life is that we will react poorly to suffering when it does arise, doing ourselves significant extra harm in the process. I think that this form of toxic positivity can also come in so-called main character syndrome. This phenomenon is often observed online and refers to someone who acts as if they are the main character in some kind of film or novel. Many people have chalked this up to simple self-importance, but I would suggest it's a bit more subtle than this. It seems like it's just as much an assumption about the world, that it will necessarily adhere to a story structure that can be made sense of at the time by placing yourself in the role of protagonist. This is different to the practice of employing narrative judiciously to understand and organize information, which is a practice touched upon by many existential philosophers. Rather, the person suffering from main character syndrome thinks that the arc of the universe tends towards their betterment. They genuinely think that it will all work out in the end, not in the sense that they will be able to cope with hardship and that they are ultimately strong enough to bear the sufferings of the world, but rather that the world itself will eventually cough up whatever it is that they want. Not necessarily through excessive hard work, as in the previous section, but just because it is the natural tendency of the world's movements. This attitude encourages us to think that this could not possibly happen to me, or that things will just happen to go our way in the end. Of course, since the universe is ultimately not constructed like this, this too sets us up for fragility and disappointment. As I mentioned in the first section, I think that the final development of this kind of toxic positivity is the moral imperative to be happy with the world and with yourself at all times. That if you dislike aspects of yourself or occasionally view reality as fundamentally unfair or uncaring, and this sometimes gets you down, that you have failed. This goes beyond merely harming ourselves and can easily begin to harm others. It means we can refuse to recognize other people's suffering or suggest that it is necessarily their fault. This is the flip side of you just haven't worked hard enough to achieve your dreams. If the universe truly is the best of all possible worlds, then we can only conclude one thing from someone's misery. They deserve their unhappiness. They must have done something wrong, and that this is a punishment. It is the same genre of reasoning that led some people in the past to see certain diseases not just as bad luck, but as a sign of the moral deficiency of the sufferer. The idea that the world is fundamentally just carries with it a sinister implication, that all perceived examples of injustice or evil must have been deserved. But lastly, I want to turn to the alternative. What is the antidote to all of this toxic positivity? Well, I think the answer is already out there in some of our richest philosophical and religious traditions. 4. The Consolation of Pessimism. When we call someone a pessimist, we tend to mean it as a bit of an insult. We think of them as unreasonably downbeat and maybe even a bit unpleasant. But I would like to say just a few words in defense of the pessimist and argue that a touch of their philosophy can actually help us in our hour of need. Firstly, when you are unhappy, the pessimist understands. Someone like Schopenhauer thought that unhappiness and frustration were some of our most natural states. For him, it was not a wonder that we were sometimes miserable, but a wonder that we were sometimes not. This reassures us that when we are unhappy, it is not that we are broken, but that we are human. We have a human will and a human mind. And as such, we just will feel awful sometimes. Secondly, the pessimistic philosophers remind us that we are not alone. And I'll be revisiting this point a lot over the course of this section. If our unhappiness is an inevitable part of being human, then that unhappiness is shared. I've mentioned this on the channel before, but I am really prone to bouts of loneliness, even when I have no reason to be. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake feeling like this, I ponder all the other people in the world who must be having the same sensation. How they too will feel this slight ache in their chest and a small lump at the back of their throat. And surprisingly, it really helps. As Camus might put it, it transforms a solitary suffering into a shared solidarity. And Schopenhauer was pretty explicit on this point as well, suggesting that we should greet one another not as sir or madam, but as fellow sufferers, to emphasize that we're all part of this community of pain. And I do think it's telling that so many religions also put forward this moderate form of pessimism. For almost all Christians, we explicitly live in a fallen world, and we ourselves are corrupted by original sin. This idea is often maligned by atheists like myself, but I actually think that there's a certain pessimistic wisdom in it. It implies that the world will not be particularly kind to us, and that we will make many mistakes. It places a lot of existence outside of our power, and states that we're going to suffer. When treated carefully, I think this general notion can be a very effective check on potential toxic positivity. My favorite form of this idea is in the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, specifically the first and third Noble Truths, that life contains suffering and that we can also alleviate that suffering. In this case, through Buddhist practice. I think this finds a very good balance between recognizing that suffering is a natural and unavoidable part of human existence, but also that there is hope. It is not unduly optimistic, but it also doesn't condemn us to a living hell either. Above all, attitudes like this eliminate the overriding idea that suffering is not normal, or is a break with the proper and predictable state of affairs, where we are happy, content, and blissful. Instead, it makes pain just the sort of thing to be expected. On the one hand, this is quite an unpleasant truth to come to terms with, because the illusion that happiness is the norm is quite comforting. It has a surface-level optimism to it that naturally inspires hope. But, as we've discussed, that particular form of hope is not all it's cracked up to be and has deeply unpleasant consequences further down the line that I think outweigh this initial benefit. And the realization that everyone else is also suffering from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune has another interesting consequence. If they are coping with it, then chances are we can as well. This may sound like the sort of overestimation of control that we talked about earlier in the video, but I think there's a crucial difference. Whereas before we were overstating how much power we had over the world, now we are looking at the evidence that people all around us are suffering in reasonably similar situations to our own, and yet are somehow holding on. And then we come to the reasonable inference that humanity has a remarkable capacity for endurance, and that perhaps that capacity is found in us as well. We have replaced reckless optimism with a kind of tempered pessimism, one which recognizes the hardships that lie ahead, but also empirically observes that those hardships are likely to be bearable. We are just one small speck at the whims of powers far beyond our control and sometimes far beyond our understanding. But if the evidence is anything to go on, we are a durable speck nonetheless. And there are billions of other specks suffering just like we are, who are our brothers and sisters in arms in this constant battle against an uncaring universe. We will never defeat the beast of unhappiness once and for all, but we can expect its arrival and take some solace in knowing that we are not its only prey. And that while none so far have outrun it, many have been able to survive the hunt. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle used to talk at length about the effects of tragic theatre, how watching a truly genius work of tragedy can cause us to reach catharsis, where we are plunged into emotional turmoil and yet find a strange peace at the other end of it. Aristotle was talking about plays, but the pessimistic philosophers can help us take a similar attitude towards life. Existence itself can be awful, and sometimes we are powerless to affect some of the major beats of our life. And yet, to confront this with a certain philosophical attitude can transform an unendurable pain into the soft, accepting catharsis of a Greek tragedy. So perhaps it is high time that many of us take a less dismissive attitude towards pessimism. As strange and counterintuitive as it might seem, sometimes it is freeing, comforting, and even purging to look suffering dead in the eye and simply say, well, this is shit. But if you want to explore more of this kind of darkly comforting philosophy, then check out this video to see why having a crush is so strangely painful. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.